Today we'll have a look at the context of An Inspector Calls, both when the play was set, performed, and the key events in Britain that happened in between. Warning, we are going to be putting on our historian hats and looking into the past to truly understand how Priestley and his audience would feel about this play. The play was written in 1945 and reflects upon the Edwardian era of 1912. The play uses the prosperity of the Burling family and their treatment of Eva to represent Priestley's views on society and status. The Edwardian period covers the reign of King Edward VII from 1901 to 1910. But it also spans from the mid-1890s until about 1914, when World War I began. This time period sees a shifting political movement. The struggles of the working class, the proletariat, were highlighted against the growing successes of industries, the bourgeoisie. Edwardian society was conducted by a number of unsaid rules that were used to keep the status quo, rich getting richer and poor getting poorer. These rules were: Number 1. A poor person has no manners, sophistication, class, or education. Number 2. A poor person cannot ever become wealthy. Ugh. Number 3. The rich and poor cannot mix. No friendships and certainly no relationships. That would be an abomination. Number 4. A poor person should be grateful for all that the rich do to help them, even though this is very little. Number 5. The rich do not want to see or hear from the poor. They are there to serve a purpose. Number 6. The rich employed the poor. Number 7. The rich can sack or punish a poor employee without any consequences. Rich people were right and poor people were wrong. And number 8. The rule that underpins them all. The rich are better than the poor. No questions asked. Now, Priestley uses An Inspector Calls to show how flawed this system is. It's hypocritical, ineffective, and damaging. He warns his audience of the disastrous consequences of an attitude like this. This social structure ends in fire and blood and anguish. So that's the Edwardian era in all its glory. But this is not the only social historical background to the play. Many huge events happened to bring about the end of this way of thinking. The first of these was the sinking of the unsinkable Titanic. The Titanic's sinking represents the hubris and arrogance of the upper class, who, despite feeling untouchable, were mere mortals, just like everybody else when disaster struck. The Titanic sinking could be interpreted as a socialist parable about the perils of capitalism, as the greed in the ship's owners may have played a part in the ship's failings. One thing was certain: the divides of class and gender were never more present than with the passengers on board. Priestley may be using the disastrous ending of the Titanic as a metaphor for society's end should people continue to avoid the socialist movement. One of the next big things that occurred between when the play was set and when it was written is the suffragette movement. Beginning around 1865, many upper and middle class women in Britain began pushing for universal suffrage, the right for all adult women to vote and stand in political elections. Dismayed with the slow pace of reform in Great Britain, in 1903 an Englishwoman named Emmeline Pankhurst founded a group called the Women's Social and Political Union that began petitioning the government for the right to vote. This group became known as the Suffragettes. In 1912, the year An Inspector Calls is set, the suffragettes switched to more militant tactics, including chaining themselves to buildings and setting fire to postboxes, and even smashing windows. Eva Smith is meant, in part, to represent the struggles of the suffragette movement. Her encounter with Mr. Burling mirrors the many failed attempts of the suffragettes to convince MPs to vote for universal suffrage prior to the First World War. Britain's entry into the First World War in August 1914 greatly accelerated the suffragettes' cause. In the absence of working-age men, millions of women went to work in munitions factories. Parliament passed, finally, the Representation of the People Act, granting voting rights to property-owning women over the age of 30. Full suffrage would follow 10 years later, but it was a great step forward for women. Yet many men were still disgruntled with the change. Priestley uses Arthur Burling as a reminder of the backwards thinking of the Edwardian era. It is a historical drama, as it's set in the run-up to World War I. This means that there are instances of dramatic irony which Priestley uses throughout the play. Characters refer to the possibility of World War I and of the calamities that would seem, to a post-World War II audience, huge landmarks in world history. The small-scale but devastating violence described in the play points to the slaughter of many thousands that will come only a few years later. And Inspector Calls is also an example of immediate post-war drama, which means that it was written after World War II. Post-war dramas take up some of the economic, political and social issues prompting that conflict, including socialism versus capitalism, democracy versus fascism, and communal versus individual rights and privileges. Although An Inspector Calls is set some 35 years before its first performance, its consideration of industrial power and human worth was still very much an issue at the time of its debut. Priestley weighs what blame belongs to whom and how ill-considered actions on the individual can have fatal, unintentional consequences. Anyone watching the play in the 1940s might see the heedlessness of Arthur, the aloofness of Sybil, the outward guilt of Sheila, or the drunkenness of Eric, both as personal flaws and as potentially allegorical statements about the national responsibility in continental Europe, the UK, and the United States. The openness with which the play ends is similarly an opportunity for re-evaluation, as Priestley never fully explains how individual crimes contribute to the more general guilt or innocence in the play's main characters. To sum up, the play is hugely political, breaking down social barriers of Edwardian England, promoting suffrage, and learning from the historical mistakes that brought about 2 world wars. Of all the texts you study in your literature course, the context here is hugely significant. The context drives the author's message, and understanding it will help you understand the language of the characters and the structure of the plot. Knowing context here will not just get you context marks. If you can prove it drives Priestley, you'll be able to truly impress the examiner.